What a clever subordinate. He actually saw through the male protagonist as a fraud at a glance. It happened just now, during the conversation between Jane and Leland. Ryan stood aside, idle as usual, and absent-mindedly started to observe the bookstore. This should be considered his occupational disease, because he used to be an information broker. After joining the White Wolf organization, he is still doing intelligence work. Currently, he even has intelligence that is only circulating in a very small range. The faceless man Daniel of Black Scales is now in the city of Nokim. And this time, he is sided with a woman, because he saw that the other party could control the power of the blood of filth. After the beastification, she was still able to keep her sanity and revert back to her original form. At that moment, he understood that Hunter's darkness might be about to change hands. This woman will bring about a revolution like never before. But even if she fails, he, Ryan, will not suffer any loss either. In his eyes, Jane is just a little girl. He uses Wizard's loyalty brand as insurance, but he doesn't know how easily this can be resolved. The ability to control beastification freely. If one were to obtain this method, it would be enough to destroy all the deadly intelligence of hunter organizations. Once obtained, even the mice in the sewer would become the kings of 100 beasts. But back to reality. Ryan felt very confused. He didn't understand this Jane. Why she was so respectful to an ordinary person. As if she was facing a strong immortal level expert. To him, what Leland said was just a bunch of empty words and bragging. And the ambiguous things he said. These are all tricks commonly used by swindlers. He is too familiar with this routine. So he figured that this person is definitely a swindler. At this moment, Leland suddenly put down the teacup with a subtle expression and said, "Sorry. Please wait a moment. I have some things to take care of. It will only take about 5 minutes." Actually, he thought no guests were coming, so he ended up drinking a bit too much tea. Now it's a bit urgent. Shortly after Leland left, Ryan couldn't sit still. He gritted his teeth and asked Jane, "What are you doing?" Jane frowned, turned to the side, and said coldly, "What's with the attitude? I brought you here because the intelligence you possess might be useful, not because I trust you or hold you in high regard. Don't you know basic manners? No manners, no rules." Ryan's face twisted instantly as he said, "But he's a liar. A complete liar. Maybe I don't understand manners, but I understand this too well. No one understands it better than me. Although his trickery is exquisite, at the very least, I can find 3 people of equal skill level to him." "Shut up. I shouldn't have brought you here in the first place. Narrow-minded indeed. Your eyes only see narrow things. If it weren't for you being useful, I would have killed you with a sword by now." Although the sword is already against my neck, Ryan still calmly said, "I am loyal to you. You will know soon. After he comes down, I will prove it to you." While speaking, Ryan quietly drew a poisoned arrow from his sleeve. A look of murderous intent appeared in his eyes. The next second, a roaring sound like an abyss rang out in the bookstore. Ryan and Jane leaned toward the counter together. The jet-black statue unexpectedly expanded rapidly at an incredible speed, resembling a shadow from hell that enveloped their figures. The statue suddenly reached out a giant hand and grabbed Ryan, feeding him directly into its mouth. Ryan disappeared without a trace like this. Jane looked at the counter tremblingly. Just now, it exhibited an extremely cruel demeanor. Alive, it devoured a human demon. But now it has turned back into a quiet statue. At this time, Leland happened to walk down the stairs. Jane looked at him. She thought to herself that this must be a warning from the bookstore owner. In that moment, not to mention Ryan, even I didn't have time to react at all. If it was me that the gargoyle attacked at that time, I would have died just like that without making a sound. The killing would have ended in an instant, as if nothing had ever happened. Is this the feeling of facing death? The close proximity makes one shudder with fear. I'm afraid he has long seen Ryan's disrespect and suspicion. but he doesn't bother to take action personally. He just casually made up an excuse to go upstairs. Let Gargoyle get rid of this ignorant and fearless guy. Such an elegant and cruel method. And the disdain for life attitude. This is simply in line with the temperament of the Dark Wizard. What should I do? How can I salvage the current situation? Damn it, I shouldn't have brought that jerk over. It's too late to seek help now. If I upset Leland, what if he thinks it was my doing? What should I do then? Leland saw her looking flustered. He said with a smile, "Jane, you look very pale." "Don't be nervous. When you come to my shop, just relax. You don't need to look so scared. Am I going to eat someone alive the moment you turn your head?" Jane was instantly frightened when she heard him talk about eating a person alive. She quickly apologized. "I am very sorry. My attendant was a bit rude just now. No, I shouldn't have brought him here. Please believe that it was not my intention." Leland seems even more nervous seeing her like this. Just now, he was just joking casually. Could it be that she took it seriously? Thinking that I would eat people. This man just made a joke with the woman next to him. The woman was so frightened that she turned pale. She quickly apologized. It turned out that it was just in the 5 minutes when Leland went upstairs. Jane's subordinate Ryan showed murderous intent. He was noticed by Gargoyle and was swallowed whole. And subsequently arrived Leland. He still joked about eating people. This really scared Jane. Leland still asked Jane what help she needed. Jane said cautiously, "Please recommend another suitable book for me. My willpower is just too weak." Leland felt that Jane's attitude was a bit strange. Just 5 minutes after he left, she acted as if she had seen a tiger, speaking more softly than usual, as if she had been emotionally hurt by something. Leland thought for a moment. Could it be because that subordinate suddenly had an urgent matter to attend to and left? Speaking of that subordinate, Leland, who was looking through the bookshelf, suddenly mentioned, "Oh, by the way, your subordinate doesn't seem quite right." It's better to say less about absolute loyalty. Listen to what Leland said. Jane's initial reaction was, "How is that possible? He has been branded with the loyalty mark." But then she reconsidered. Leland wouldn't say such a thing without reason. Could it be a problem with the loyalty rune? The loyalty brand written by White Wizard through the rune can only be removed by the person themselves. The family wizard would, supported by my father, wrote the rune for Ryan's soul. If Ryan's brand fails, it means that Wood is likely to sell the revoked rune to someone else without authorization. Jane can't believe this is true. If that's the case, then who should she believe? At this point, Leland said, "The one you can rely on, believe in, is only yourself. Other people are hell. By any means. You can't let a person's heart be completely exposed in front of you. So when you are as indestructible as steel, no one can defeat you." After saying that, Leland handed her a classic book, How the Steel Was Tempered. And then he smiled and said, "Whatever you have learned from it will be helpful. The most precious thing for a person is life. It only happens once. One's life should be spent in this way. When you look back on the past, you will not regret wasting your time in mediocrity, nor feel guilty for being vile. You have your own mission." Jane stood in the rain dazedly. She looked at the book in her hand. At this moment, the cover of the book was no longer How the Steel Was Tempered, but had changed to Iron Will. The moment she opened the book and flipped through it, an invisible force directly filled her entire body. This force acted upon her soul. Yes, this is the indelible iron will in her after she received this force. She instinctively headed towards the bookstore. Through the glass window of the bookstore, she could see Leland browsing books on the shelves. He seemed ordinary at best. So she set her sights on the gargoyle, only to see the jet-black statue. It gathers nearly 1,000 souls on it. They are densely packed together, wailing and roaring. The most prominent among them is the soul of Ryan. Wood's brand was indeed removed. Suddenly, Jane only felt a piercing pain. She actually started to have a nosebleed. But when she opened her eyes again, she felt the changes in her soul, but then muttered to herself, "No wonder it's Leland. He easily reshaped the structure of my soul and instilled a huge amount of ether into my body. Now I finally have a chance to break through the panic level." After she wiped away the nosebleed with the back of her hand. This kind of satisfaction that is about to overflow from being filled up is not bad at all. She can receive such a gift. It's not an exaggeration to say that Leland has given me a second life. I think Leland definitely wants to cultivate my influence in Hunter, and gradually change the stage and ecosystem of Hunter. So that's why he has been giving me such generous help. I completely understand your meaning. From now on, I will be absolutely loyal to your will. My body, my everything will be at your disposal. I will never disappoint you again. But her solemn oath of loyalty did seem a bit strange in Leland's eyes. It turned out that Leland had just finished organizing the bookshelf. As he turned around to go back, he caught a glimpse of Jane out of the corner of his eye. She seemed to be wiping her nosebleed. She is still bowing in his direction. And this series of actions, why does it always feel a bit strange? He thought to himself that this guy wouldn't have any obsessive woman attributes, right? After being abandoned by that scumbag, is she coming to my bookstore so frequently because she covets my good looks? Thinking of this, Leland felt a chill down his spine. But the next second, he felt it was somewhat impossible. After all, she was a super Jane. How could she possibly be interested in an ordinary person like him? He was the former Radiant Grand Knight of the Arcane Tower. A powerful individual at the devastating level. But today, he made a fool of himself in such an ordinary bookstore. He was knocked down with just one glance. It turns out it was just now. Joseph came to the bookstore to investigate Danny's whereabouts. Leland felt very happy when he saw a new customer arrive just after sending Jane away. However, when he approached to take a look, the new customer seemed a bit unfriendly. Nonetheless, he still welcomed them and inquired about what type of books they were looking for. Upon entering, Joseph began to observe the layout of the store. After a moment of observation, he found that this was indeed just an ordinary bookstore, with no sign of any anomaly in the store or on the young man. Therefore, he felt there was no need to waste any more time. This young man probably didn't know anything about Danny. The situation was now crystal clear. The only anomaly is this gargoyle. And then he suddenly fixed his gaze on Leland and said, "You are the owner of this bookstore." Leland nodded and said, "Yes, uncle, that's correct." At the first sound of the other party calling himself Uncle Joseph, he felt as if struck by lightning in his heart. He actually called me uncle. If a young knight comes over and talks like that, Joseph will definitely smash his skull. But he sees the other side as a common man. He eventually swallowed his pride. He leaned on the counter and asked, "Is that gargoyle yours?" Leland smiled and replied, "It's a souvenir given to me by a friend. However, it's not for sale." Joseph, hearing him say that, became even more annoyed. He couldn't understand why, as a Radiant Knight, he would want to buy a gargoyle made by an evil dark wizard. However, he decided to swallow his pride for now. He continued to ask, "Frank Daniel, is he the guest you're talking about?" Yes. Leland felt like something was off when he heard the tone of the conversation. Judging by his attitude, could it be that he had a grudge against Danny? But it doesn't seem right either. Based on Leland's many years of experience in judging people, this uncle, although aggressive, should not be a bad person. Moreover, after he entered the shop, although he had a strong presence, he didn't actually damage any items in the store. From this perspective, he seems to be a thoughtful and gentle person. There is no reason for someone like him to pick a fight with Danny, who is harmless and scholarly. If that's the case, there is only one truth. Leland smiled and said to him, "Uncle, you are Mr. Daniel's friend, aren't you?" Hearing Leland talking about friends, Joseph felt as uncomfortable as constipation in his heart. but he still struggled to speak. We are considered friends. We have known each other for many years. We are old acquaintances to each other. It can be said that we are truly close friends. But 2 years ago, we had a small disagreement, and he left without saying goodbye. It wasn't until recently that I got news of him. Leland listened to what he said, and immediately started imagining it in his mind. He then smiled and said, "So that's it. No wonder you can recognize this as Mr. Daniel's stuff at a glance. It's really an enviable friendship. Mr. Daniel will be touched when he knows." At this point, Joseph asked if he knew Danny's address. However, Leland expressed that he didn't know either, but he said that he would help inform when Danny comes next time. He also asked Joseph if he wanted to sit down and rest for a while, or maybe read a book. Joseph couldn't help but sigh after hearing him say this. Does he really look so useless now? But he still felt very chatty about Leland's casual way of speaking. After all, it had been a long time since anyone could talk to him like this after becoming a Radiant Grand Knight. However, he still said arrogantly, "Don't underestimate old people. How tiring can it be? If you really want me to sit down and have some tea, that's fine too. As for reading, it's not necessary. I don't like reading much." Upon hearing his words, Leland knew immediately that he was a proud and stubborn old man. Afterwards, he handed me a cup of tea to gesture that reading in the bookstore was free, but only limited to the lending area behind me. Joseph originally intended to sit for a while, and then leave. However, his headache suddenly started. At this moment, he saw the books that Leland had placed next to him. His eyes suddenly focused. Spawn of the Abyss. Leland seems interested in this book. The Little Prince. So he said, "I happen to be reading a very relaxing and heartwarming fairy tale. It's very soothing. Would you like to give it a try? Reading it before bed can really help relieve stress." But Joseph just chuckled. He dismissed fairy tales as childish and ridiculous. "You're not that young anymore," he said. However, he soon found himself proven wrong, because Leland wasn't interested in his opinion. So he took back the Little Prince beside him. Joseph saw this. He suddenly had a twitch in his face. He pointed to the book in Leland's hand and said, "You just said this book is a fairy tale, are you sure?" Leland, upon hearing him ask like this, nodded inexplicably and replied, "Of course, this is a very good fairy tale storybook. This is an absolute classic. Do you have any questions?" His words really left Joseph dumbfounded. This is a big problem. Whose bedtime fairy tale is named Spawn of the Abyss? Is this your Dream Beast fairy tale? Although he found this inexplicable fairy tale story unbelievable, Joseph couldn't help but feel curious. So he said, "Let me take a look. But you must not misunderstand. I am not interested in this fairy tale story at all. I'm just satisfying your desire to recommend this book. I'm just taking a casual look." Leland heard him saying this. He thought, the more ferocious a man appears on the outside, the gentler he is inside, like a young girl. But the moment when Leland handed the book to Joseph, Joseph only glanced at the cover. The familiar sharp pain and dizziness suddenly hit him. The demonic sword inside his body seemed to resonate with something. Gradually, his body began to lose balance. His eyes slowly closed as well. The mighty Radiant Grand Knight Joseph was thus defeated with a single move. Leland was startled to see him suddenly fall down. He thought he might have had a stroke or a brain hemorrhage. Hurriedly, he went forward to check his heartbeat. He was even thinking about calling an ambulance. However, after checking his pulse, he seemed to have more strength than Leland. It seemed like he was just asleep. He is very healthy. But at that moment, Leland began to feel puzzled. How could he suddenly faint? It couldn't be related to his own book, could it? There's no logic in this world where one would suddenly fall ill just from glancing at the Little Prince. But for now, there's nothing he can do. He can only wait until Uncle wakes up to ask about the situation. He is Greg, a reconnaissance agent from the intelligence agency of the Arcane Tower. He is also a big fanboy of Radiant's Great Knight Joseph. Out of curiosity about his idol, he transformed into a black cat and followed Joseph to this bookstore. He originally thought that nothing unexpected would happen, so he waited outside the door. After waiting for about 10 minutes, he tentatively pushed the door open, wanting to catch a glimpse of Joseph's demeanor. The first thing he saw was that turned out to be Joseph collapsing straight down. He was instantly struck as if by lightning when he saw this scene, not knowing what had happened to make Joseph, who was just moments ago chatting and laughing, suddenly collapse. Who on earth is this young man? Did he use some kind of evil witchcraft? He then saw this young man immediately. He showed no mercy or kindness. He rudely dragged the unconscious knight to a cold corner. He said with his mouth, "Even the iron-blooded have fairy tale-like dreams. You can sleep peacefully." Upon hearing these words, Greg couldn't help but shiver. He thought the other person was trying to make Joseph sleep forever. Suddenly he felt like he had been found out. Immediately, he turned around and fled, because he knew this was not something he could deal with right now. After fleeing from the ascending Greg, his face turned pale. He collapsed on the ground, trembling all over. He thought to himself, is this what it feels like to brush against death? That person could have caught me, but deliberately let me go. They must want me to go back and deliver a message. It seems that he has no choice now. He can only hurry back with the message. But in fact, the reality is slightly different from what he saw. The reason why Leland dragged Joseph so roughly was because the other person was too heavy. He was like a brown bear. His whole body was like steel muscles. It was really outrageous. He couldn't lift him at all, so he had to drag him. This scene happened to be seen by Greg, leading to a clever misunderstanding. At this moment, Leland is looking at Joseph's metal prosthesis. He thought to himself, this uncle is actually disabled just like Danny. This kind of precision metal prosthesis. It should not be something that ordinary people can use. In addition to Uncle's amazing physical strength, there is that kind of extraordinary momentum. Is he actually a retired senior military officer? That should be correct. This uncle resembles the retired officers I've encountered before. They all have a natural sense of rigidity and integrity. Seeing the ferocity and exhaustion he displays, it should be because of his experiences on the battlefield. He likely suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, after coming down from the battlefield. And the lost right arm represents his glory on the battlefield. Such an old man is usually the most stubborn and obstinate. No wonder he is so proud and temperamental. I see now. I completely understand. Just now, he suddenly collapsed. It should be because the metal prosthesis was short-circuited, which caused a fainting spell. This explains it. On the other side, the unconscious Joseph has once again fallen into hallucinations. But strangely, this time the hallucinations did not make him feel any pain. At this moment, the pages of the book began to flip rapidly, with unspeakable forbidden language flashing before his eyes. The person who gazes into the abyss is also being stared at by the abyss. He will be further acknowledged by the abyss. Joseph looked at the contents of the book incredulously. Is this the text recorded in the so-called fairy tale story? The next second, the words in the book rushed into his brain like a tide, as if they were about to burst him. But he felt no pain at all, even feeling very happy. The feeling of swelling and pain is gradually disappearing. Just now, the demonic sword Candela was actually delighted. So it's such a fairy tale story. Indeed, this fairy tale story is meant for children to read. Joseph suddenly opened his eyes. He looked around in confusion. He looked again at the fairy tale story in his hand. At this moment, Leland saw that he had woken up. He waved at him in greeting. Joseph heard the familiar voice. He felt like he was waking from a dream and said a thank you to him. Feeling so polite, Leland immediately said it was no problem. It was all he should do. He also asked how he was feeling now. No big deal, right? Joseph moved all the joints and muscles in his body a little. He made a fist gesture. He indicated that he is doing well now. He is better than ever before. Leland watched him closely, thinking about Uncle's current momentum. One punch could really be fatal. If it were Danny's weak body, even just one punch could send half of their body flying. Fortunately, they are friends. This man. He just handed out a fairy tale storybook. He made this tough guy obsessed with it and unable to extricate himself. It also calmed down the demonic sword Candela inside him. Just now, Joseph, who had just awakened, expressed his gratitude to Leland. Upon seeing this, Leland smiled and replied, "No need to be too polite. I've said similar words to Mr. Daniel before. Guests are always welcomed. It's my duty to help those in need." Joseph listened to Leland's words with a pensive expression. So that's how it is. He seemed to have understood the style of the bookstore owner. If helping customers is taken for granted, that is to say, the position of this bookstore owner is a neutral attitude that helps any customer. Anyone who can enter this store is a customer of this bookstore, and someone he will help. He can steadfastly implement this kindness based on his own will. He has only seen this practice in one group, which is the elf. These ancient races are long-lived, elegant, and full of wisdom. If the owner of the bookstore is one of them, then everything becomes reasonable. Only a long life can make him lose the will to distinguish between good and evil, and instead start pursuing new pleasures. His attitude towards people is so gentle and polite. This must be the grace and elegance accumulated by the passage of time. As for opening a bookstore, it is indeed an expression of elf's respect for wisdom. Nowadays, human beings do not have much interest in books. And among the legends passed down for thousands of years, Candela is the prince of the ancient elf kingdom. He later became the elf king of Moon. He was also the source of the Great Plague and the first one to go mad. He killed himself with his own sword. The sword became the bond, nailed his soul. His soul turned into a curse, making this long sword, named after the prince, turn into the insane demonic sword. Every owner of the demonic sword thereafter will eventually die after going mad. Before today, Joseph also once thought that this day was not far from him. But he didn't expect this book. It could actually soothe the demonic sword Candela. So the bookstore owner, who owns such a book, besides an elf, could there be anything else? And the elf, who owns such a book, must be an ancient creature who has lived until now. He must have used all his magic to extend his life, resulting in no trace of ether fluctuations in his body. It all makes sense. Very good, everything is explained. Thinking about this, Joseph asked, "You said earlier that this book is the only unique copy, and you enjoy reading it. Can it still be loaned out?" Leland is already so fascinated by it. He thought that indeed the best way to handle it is after being Sundara. Then it's time for his healing soul session. Leland smiled and replied, "Of course, if it cannot be borrowed, I will not recommend it to you. Many people like you would suffer a lot due to internal struggles and regrets. They feel inadequate and blame themselves for such occurrences, leading to self-doubt and eventually being tormented and driven insane. But actually, it was never the pain that defeated them. What defeated them was their cowardice and benevolence." Upon hearing Leland's mention of benevolence, Joseph thought of the two former holders of the demonic sword that he had encountered. Their final regrets were all rooted in unwillingness. Their own strength was not sufficient. He wondered if sticking to benevolence was wrong. At this point, Leland said, "Benevolence is a good thing, but the key word is weakness. Due to others' high expectations, stemming from one's noble character and sense of responsibility. He wants to give others more confidence and help. So he makes himself look invincible. But in reality, such defense is extremely weak. This kind of benevolence can save others, but cannot redeem oneself. Once his mind collapses, any factor could take advantage of it. Sometimes, don't consider yourself an invincible hero. Be an ordinary person. Proper avoidance is actually a kind of courage. It won't crush you either." Listening to Leland's Chinese, Joseph also thought to himself, "So that's it. It's not that the curse of the demonic sword is too powerful, but his excessive pursuit of perfection leads to contamination. Damn, why did no one realize this for so long? But just pacifying it, can it last? Joseph frowned and asked. Leland listened to him ask this way. In his heart, he secretly complained. Of course not. If fairy tales were so useful, what would psychologists be needed for? But he still smiled in response. Of course not. But if you are willing, you can hand it over to me to solve. I guarantee long-term effectiveness. He thought to himself, in this way, wouldn't I have a long-term client with psychological problems to solve? But when Joseph heard him say this, he was full of disbelief. He couldn't help but wonder if the bookstore owner was willing to voluntarily take on the madness curse of the demonic sword Candela.